Search services have been held across Norway after the twin bombing and shooting attacks that killed more than 90 people. A 32-year-old Norwegian man has been arrested and charged over those attacks.
Now, as well as being a regular contributor to this program, Waleed Aly is a lecturer at Monash University's Global Terrorism Research Centre. He's analysed so-called homegrown terrorism, and he joins us now. Waleed, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
But is this necessarily homegrown terrorism?
Yeah, I think this is a case of terrorism. It's certainly homegrown, and I think it's a case of terrorism because it depends largely on how you define it, but the elements of terrorism that we can be pretty confident have a lot of agreement are that it's political violence, so violence or the threat of violence with a political motive, usually done to induce fear or anxiety by a non-state actor. There's arguments over the non-state actor bit, but nonetheless, they're the broad terms, and I think this certainly seems to fit the category. The obvious comparison that people might be tempted to draw between Breivik on the one hand, well, with Breivik is Martin Bryant, this sort of the mass murderer, the serial killer. He's not really a serial killer, was he? He was just engaged in a massacre. This is a very different case. Martin Bryant was basically a loner who was bullied and wanted to get attention. He said he'd do something that made everyone remember him. That's not the case here. What you've got here is someone who had a very clear political agenda. It's attributed to him that there's a manifesto online, which I've had a look at, and it's very clear that he has a political idea about the way the world should look, what the problems that have occurred in the world, particularly in Europe. He blames cultural Marxism for it and thinks that multiculturalism particularly is an anti-European hate ideology and so on. So these things need to be addressed. And so he called for he called a conservative revolution, which is an odd term, but nonetheless that's what he called for. So there's clear political imperatives here. And he fits within sort of this broad movement that's occurring throughout Europe a bit more now, this sort of far-right movement that's anti-multiculturalism, anti-immigrant, but also anti-left generally. And so you're seeing this emerge not just in Norway, but in Denmark, in Sweden even, which a lot of people didn't think would happen, but it did. You've seen Geert Wilders, obviously, in the Netherlands. Now, not all are as extreme as him, clearly, and not all embrace violence, but he nonetheless does fit within that broad sort of political thrust.
So it's a problem authorities in countries like Norway have overlooked, really?
Well, I mean, yeah, the problem with it is that you can't... It's hard to focus on this as a real threat to the nation when these sort of parties are forming governing coalitions.
But the incitement's out there to people who obviously have a screw loose, like with this guy.
Oh, yeah, clearly. I mean, that sort of incitement is there and it's dangerous. And occasionally you will get something like this emerge. But the phenomenon of this kind of domestic terrorism is not entirely a new one. And this is something that I think we've forgotten because in the shadow of 9/11, we've sort of figured that terrorism is something that foreigners do, it's something that other people do, and if it's homegrown, well, they're children of immigrants and so on. It's been framed in that way. We've kind of forgotten that there's actually quite an illustrious history of domestic terrorism, particularly in the United States. Europe's had a bit of it, but nowhere near the extent that the US has.
I'm sure you don't mean to say illustrious there, but... the issue of the northern countries, in particular the Nordic countries and Sweden, you mentioned in passing there, it's been for at least a couple of decades now a real problem with right-wing extremism, particularly amongst a couple of youth subcultures, neo-Nazism and the like. It's turned up in their music, in their art, in their graffiti and in the pleasure that they try to take. What's interesting, though, in the country where this all came about in Germany, they've been much more vigilant about the rise of that, particularly amongst young people, and it's been squashed and attempted to be quashed wherever it turns up. Why have these Nordic countries been a bit lax on that front?
Well, I think if you live in Germany, I mean, I was in Berlin last year, you are surrounded by the history of the Holocaust and then the consequences of World War II, particularly expressed in the Cold War. So you live with this and you have to try to overcome this every day. And so anything that has the whiff of National Socialism in Germany is immediately stamped out. You saw this last year with the controversy with Sarazen's book. Sarazen, of course, is part of what we would call the Reserve Bank. And he's come out and made these sort of anti-immigrant statements, and it triggered a huge problem in German politics. Now, in the rest of Europe, where the history isn't that direct, I mean, you know, it wasn't the heartland of Nazism. Germany was. So in the rest of Europe, there's not the same sort of closeness. There's not the same sort of memory of that. There's a memory of World War II, but there's not the same kind of ownership of it. And so you'd expect that people are going to be a bit more relaxed about it.
Has immigration caused the social dislocation that some extremists argue that it has?
Well, immigration, partly, but I think it's not, you can't focus on that one factor. I think you can put this in a broader context of globalisation more generally. The fact that what you have is the dislocation of social structures that were once much neater in the minds of people within national borders, that's breaking down. And so, but one of the ironies of this, the irony of the anti-globalisation movement generally, is that it's a thoroughly globalised movement. And so with a lot of these neo-Nazi movements, they're actually now creating global connections in Europe to the United States and to Australia even, because of the online space. And so there's this kind of sharing of information and ideology. Now, it's not clear in this case that Breivik was connected to some kind of vast network. That's not clear. But the ideological currents are kind of there, and you can see them in him and in that manifesto, assuming, of course, that the attribution to him is accurate.
And we hope this blunts the rise of far-right parties in Europe. They've been enjoying some success. I think the Sweden Democrats scored really well at recent elections there.
Oh, and even in the EU elections we saw that happen. So look, this is not something that has come completely out of nowhere, and I think that needs to be borne in mind. But that's not to say that that the entire movement of the far right is heading in a terrorist direction. That's a slightly different thing. This is a clear case of terrorism, though, it seems to me, and it needs to be understood as such. In that long line of domestic terrorism that the United States has been the most famous example of. You had Timothy McVeigh and so on, and it went down after 9/11 and it spiked again. But this is not an entirely new phenomenon we're dealing with here.
Waleed Aly, good to see you. Thank you.
No worries.
Thanks.